Excellent. Welcome, everybody, and good afternoon, good evening. We come from all different corners of the globe to our roundtable sponsored by Research on Interdisciplinary Global Studies and the Garden Project, and of course, the editors of the lovely edited volume on intelligent oversight in times of transnational impunity. Who will watch the watchers? And it's really my delight to bring here together a number of scholars and practitioners, I should say, former practitioners from a variety of disciplines here today to discuss the workings of Western intelligence and intelligence oversight, specifically over time and across the different cases that were, as I mentioned, published in the Francis Taylor or Rutledge edited volume. And among our esteemed panelists today, we have Professor Didier Bigot, who is Professor Emeritus at Sciences Po. We have Professor Elspeth Gill, who is Professor Emeritus also from Queen Mary, University of London. Emma McCloskey, who is a lecturer at the University of Westminster. Cynthia Nolan, Associate Professor at American Military University in the US, and Damien Rogers, who is an Associate Professor at Massey University in New Zealand. Unfortunately, Ronja Kniep, who is a research fellow at the Berlin Social Science Center, cannot make it today due to illness, but we wish her well and a swift recovery. But before I launch right into the gist of our debates and discussions, because we have quite a few issues that require really deep delving attention, I wanted to introduce our panel and the book more broadly speaking. And it's needless to say that these contributions come at an opportune time where we need to fuel much more conversation about these topics, not only because of also growing use of artificial intelligence in our daily lives, hence also for intelligence services and the overall field. One just has to mention, for instance, the German government, where the Minister of Interior had, in I think it was late March, organized the 5th Symposium on the Law of Intelligence Services, or in German, Symposium zum Recht der Nachrichtendienste. And so interestingly here, we had a closed shop session, and this comes with sort of a lot of public criticism in recent years against the Germans or the agencies. And so that closed shop session, again, raises potential questions in terms of how can we deal with these things. And I don't have to go all the way to Germany, even though this is sort of my origins, where I was born and raised. Here in the US, my country of choice, you've probably followed that the US Congress has passed sort of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or renewed the act, at least for another 2 years. And I'm glad to have Cindy here with us today, so she can probably also chime in on some of the things but most importantly, the issue here lies in the technicalities when amendments were sort of pushed back and forth, and including sort of provision that says any other service provider with basically access to equipment that is being or may be used to transmit and store wire or electronic communications. And for those who are not familiar with FISA, right, it's basically the US government having the right, necessarily without a warrant, because of that act, to surveil foreigners, but communications with U.S. citizens can include foreigners, and so they're legal loopholes, and so that causes them problems, of course, for U.S. citizens, but not only. And the idea of properly requesting warrants through the courts is here also in question. The book, as I mentioned earlier, was sort of a multi-year, multilateral collaboration between the UK, the German, and the French team. And the Germans are not represented here today, but they really looked at the types of oversight and the official and institutional forms thereof, trying to also think or look at the lens of civil society actors. I'm thinking here in particular from Torsten Wetzing and his team. On the British side, we do have a representative here, and I look forward to hear more about the output and sort of the trajectories where we're going here. But it was really looking at the conditions for trust between the services and the nation in terms of and the notion of democratic regimes and practices here. And so on the French side, we have a few members here, and so the idea here of looking into the challenges, difficulties of effective democratic oversight, and whether it's due to sort of concerted strategies of intelligence actors, or whether there are sort of effects of socio-historical factors that constrain some of these activities in terms of the legislative, the media realm, and or advocacy groups. And so we'll have today an opportunity to really further delve into some of these findings and discuss some of the challenges and difficulties when attempting sort of to conceptualize and particularly implement an oversight that goes beyond these national boundaries, holding those who committed grave human rights abuses responsible. And the roundtable, as I envision it, is sort of probably going into 2 or 3 different sections, where first I really want to give those who are here today an opportunity to sort of frame and contextualize their work, the past work that's been published, the work that you continue to progress, and then sort of shift to further delve and deepen some of the discussions over the challenges and the impediments in terms of progressing towards a better oversight, and then concluding with sort of a pathway to reform efforts, because we shouldn't forget the silver lining, as Elspeth and Emma mentioned earlier. And so while sometimes there might be doomsday scenarios, I think it's really important to really take that into account. And so without further ado, maybe I'd love to kick it off with Didier, who's been sort of quite a pillar in the field, and then the book was sort of framed around some Bourdieusian ideas of capital and habitus. And so why don't you say a few words, Didier, in terms of sort of your work, and especially when you look at the chapter in the book, you've also teased out some of the tensions that come with sort of preventive and predictive security. And so I think that might be a good starting point to sort of contextualize some of these actors. You've coined the terms guilds in sort of these security studies. So why don't you take a few moments to sort of set the frame, and then we'll walk through the room, our virtual room, and have everyone sort of add and build on some of these conceptual but also very empirically grounded building blocks. So Didier, floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Arnaud. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Cynthia, to join us and to discuss the book. And thank you, of course, of all the other panelists. Well, maybe on the book, one element which is important is from the very beginning to say that we have tried to escape from the traditional vision of intelligence studies concerning the notion of oversight and not democratic control. And I think it's important because in some way you had a lot of interesting and in-between space in different books concerning oversight. And you have even some specific book on oversight. But very often they have been remotely independent of the starting hypothesis of intelligence studies. And the intellectual framing of oversight has been seen as a sub-problem of national security and the need for secrecy, will reveal the deep roots of the orthodoxy widely exposed by the intelligence services themselves. So the question of oversight has been seen in the context in which the framing was justifying via sovereignty a secret use of force as a trans-historical and essential to the survival of the state. The exception of sovereignty overrides the possibility for a democratic control as such. And in many cases, what we have seen from the different interview and from what the person in charge said also is that oversight was to be accepted by the intelligence services themselves, to have a chance to have trust between them in order to do their control. So the notion of control is not a hierarchical control, but more what is called a mutual discussion or this kind of element. And of course, it creates a real problem for all the different instances or agencies who are in charge about the democratic control in terms of range of their capacity to do an overview and to have some power and remedies if necessary. This is quite what we have seen, which is an overall element. But one of the key problems is when you have coalition of intelligence services. And that's what I have tried to do more specifically in my own research. What happens when you have a coalition of intelligence services, like the Five Eyes, for example, and we can go more in details, of course, about each example. They are not the only one. You can think about the extraordinary rendition and the ring of complicity, or now with Pegasus, and the development of Israeli, French, German, US companies who are part of the private organization, but also linked with the top level of their own government in different way. And what is really important is that for the different organizations, they are very often blocked by the impossibility to know not what their own intelligence services are doing, but what the other intelligence services have done. And so they don't have at all an overview. They are blocked by the so-called third-party rule, or it could be a different denomination. What is important is that de facto they cannot connect with the other oversight services to reach the overview which is necessary when you have a coalition. We have seen, of course, that some countries have been condemned for complicity, while the main actors have been left in impunity. And that's really what we want to discuss. And for that, I have tried to develop a more global notion of field or transversal field, international field, in which multiple actors are present. And this field is connecting all the different forms and actors who resort to covert form of violence and engage in intrusive surveillance. They are commissioned or at least sanctioned by executive branches of government that identify themselves as democracy and are based on the separation of power. And I think it's really important because in all discussion, each time we reach the limits, the argument of this democracy is to speak about the competition with autocratic government, and that because of the fact that this autocratic government can do what they want, they need to do the same. So you have a kind of mimesis, which is the attempt to do the same in response, while considering that democracy in that case is blocking them in their action. And we need really to go back to this point because that's on the mindset of the different intelligence services. We have discussed with, and especially the most important member of the Security Council, so US, UK, and France. So we are going beyond the Five Eyes, which are the most keen to keep this kind of capacity to act outside of their direct zone and to have a global view, or at least a large regional view. It's very, very different, as we have seen in the book, by group of countries which have not this kind of ambition. Belgium, Norway, New Zealand, and others have a very different view. So what is significant is certainly that what is at stake, and I will finish with that, is that only the most important government who act abroad and consider violence is a solution, consider also that the control, democratic control, is unnecessary, or that if it is necessary, it's purely a formal control, which is hierarchical and depend to the different authority and need to go to them against some deviation by individual, but not a structural problem. And what we try to challenge here is this way, and we are not the only one. If you read the book, you will see that most of the people who are inside the service have a narrative, which can be a hidden narrative, about the necessity for them to have democratic control. And I keep that for the discussion if some people are interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Didier, for sort of providing us with this conceptual framing and really steeping in sort of this notion of field and expanding it. And I think that might be a really good opportunity, because some of our contributors, François Thier has also sort of questions or ask questions about sort of to what extent do services or members of the services then like guidelines lines, they don't want to interpret certain things. And so I want to turn my attention a bit to Elspeth, if you'd like, since I wouldn't say you're at the polar opposite, you do sort of sociology of law. And so it really delves also into these questions from a sociological perspective, but your subject matter is the law. And can you a bit expand on some of the things that Didier has said in view of trying to find legal sort of ways of really promoting some of these oversights. You and Sophia came up with a nice sort of parallel in the book, right, based on the Convention of Torture and the things that are in place, and that it is the states who push for these legal frameworks. It's not sanctioned or sort of pushed and forced upon them, right? You sign up for it, so you have that will. So if you would like to sort of jump in here and expand on sort of some of that legal field that really also inundates, for better or worse, right, at times, because it can also be hijacked and or because of the interpretation of certain statutes and laws be turned around. And so I'd like you to sort of comment and expand on some of your research that you've been doing here.
Thank you so much, Arno, and thank you so much for putting this together. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think that for my contribution, your introduction really gave me the whole framework in which I want to develop this, because as you mentioned, you had a conference in Germany on laws on intelligence services. And this is seen generally as international comparative law. So it's the constitution of each country which determines what the laws are on the limitations of intelligence services. So in this context, also, as you mentioned, with the renewal of the US Congress on the Foreign Intelligence Services Act, the powers in that act are specifically defined so they don't run into difficulties with the US Constitution to apply only to foreign nationals. And the collateral damage, as you mentioned, are US citizens who happen to be in contact with foreign nationals. Looking at this framework within which intelligence services work, so it's national constitutional frameworks, yet, as Didier was mentioning, what is involved is transnational cooperation, particularly in the context of the collection and sharing of personal data on persons. We need then to look at international rules about personal data, its collection and use, if we're going to find a common floor in respect of which we can determine the legality of the practices of intelligence services, particularly in the area of surveillance, which primarily involves the collection, storage, use, and transfer of personal data of individuals. So when we were brought into this project from this perspective, saying, well, if on the one hand we only have constitutional limitations to the powers of intelligence services provided by democracies, what is left when those powers are used in a way which leaves completely unprotected the alien or the foreigner as fair game for any intelligence service to collect data on the foreigner, the alien? And we began to look at international human rights law, and in particular, the right to privacy and the right to respect for privacy, and what that means in terms of the conditions of possibility of the international legality of collecting data on individuals who are not your citizens. And here we looked very much at the international outrage which followed the Snowden revelations of what the NSA had been up to in terms of collecting massive amounts of data, personal data of non-nationals, which was then stored, was manipulated, was subjected to all kinds of what we would now say were AI tools to sift through all this data in the attempt to determine who might or might not be a threat. Now, on the one hand, you have the tremendous interest of all states to determine threats and their entitlement to protect themselves from threats by individuals, be they citizens or foreigners. But you also have the right to privacy of the individual to make choices regarding the collection and use of his or her personal data. And we need to find what the common ground is between, on the one hand, the internationally recognized human right to privacy and the entitlement of states to protect themselves from threats. And here, the principle in international law regarding personal data is that personal data always belongs to the individual. The individual cannot sell it, cannot alienate themselves from their personal data in any manner which is permissible in international law. They always have sovereignty over their personal data. So every time a person gives up their personal data, fills in some form of a government regarding their personal data, the rules of data protection under the right to privacy apply, limiting the use of that data to the purpose for which the individual handed it over, and the use of that data only for that purpose, unless the individual accepts and has given informed consent to its use otherwise. And against this rule, the mass collection of data for the purposes of running it through databases to see whether or not the person might or might not be a risk to security runs into difficulties. The kinds of operations which those procedures of surveillance are using must be designed in such a way that they protect the right to privacy. A classic example in the world of the exchange of personal data is the difference between advanced passenger information for people traveling internationally and passenger name records. In respect of advanced passenger data, the only data which is being exchanged is that which is in the passport and must be deleted within a very short period of time, 24 to 48 hours, whereas passenger name record information includes a much wider range of data, which an individual might not agree to have shared. So what we're really looking at is the question of proportionality, the capacity to justify using personal data that has been collected in the context of surveillance, its storage, and the circumstances in which it must be deleted from the context of an international human rights law perspective, not that of national constitutional law, which, as the US law itself shows, is designed to protect the citizen, but leave the foreigner open to abuse.
Thank you so much, Alpes, for this overview. And you hit a point that I mentioned earlier, right? Protecting constitutionally national or citizens, but yet making out of foreign aliens then sort of almost a prey to government institutions, right? And putting in that extra layer of protection is certainly very, very crucial here. And thanks for elaborating on this. I want to turn maybe my attention staying in sort of this idea of privacy and data collection. Emma, you've worked on sort of these the idea of SIGINT, signal intelligence, and so you've really tried to dig deeper into sort of this discourse between the services in the UK and sort of like this idea of trust and legitimacy. So if you could sort of based on your research that you've carried out there and potentially what you're currently doing, elaborate and introduce our viewers and listeners to some of the crux of your work.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much, Anna, and thanks again for organizing this. Yeah, so just to situate our research a little bit, so we were part of the Guardant project together with Didier and the French team, and it was Claudia Aradao and I in the UK. And what we ended up doing in our research was really to try to focus on the UK and some kind of specific legislative struggle around different surveillance laws, and then to see kind of how this landscape, how the oversight landscape around different legislation, how this changed over the decades. You know, how exactly, what were these shifts taking place, what was enabled and what was foreclosed when it comes to oversight, taking this kind of longer view. And I think why the UK was interesting in itself, you know, it kind of sees itself as a model in this regard, especially since 2016, we had the passing into law of the Investigatory Powers Act, which was seen to be this, I mean, it was seen by some people to be this sort of gold standard. You have the Special Rapporteur for Privacy going around saying the UK has this sort of gold standard of oversight legislation. Yeah, so what was interesting was to unpack that a little bit. So what I did was I talked to a lot of the main protagonists involved around, starting with this legislative struggle around the Investigatory Powers Act. Who were the different you know, critics involved? We talked to civil society actors, oversight actors, members of parliament, different bodies, investigative journalists, to look at exactly, you know, what was this changing landscape? What were the various challenges, the different controversies? How did these challenges affect different understandings of democracy, right, and democratic culture? So what we did in the UK was really to try to look at changing understandings of democratic practice, which were enabled with these different understandings of democracy. So I took this oral history approach. I think what was so interesting, in doing this research, I interviewed maybe about 30 people, asking them just to go through it, this sort of very ethnographic way, which arguments, how do they remember things playing out, what were the big successes. And I think what was so interesting was this idea of this discourse of ever improving democratic oversight, and the UK as a sort of gold standard was really sort of undone and contradicted when you started to really map some of these democratic frames that were being used. So in the book, in the chapter that I wrote with Claudia Aradao, we were looking at some of these different strategies and tactics through which impunity is enabled, right? So it's not reduced, it's enabled. But it's channeled through these very different forms. So you mentioned, Arnaud, this idea of trust, which I think is so interesting, because now, and Didier mentioned in his intervention about this idea of this increased trust between the overseers and the agencies, between the public, and trust as this kind of glue which binds it all together. And what we argue is, these different frames that are used. Trust is one that we see all the time. And we've seen even after the Snowden revelations in the UK, this was framed as arousing a crisis of trust, right? It's arousing a crisis of trust in the agencies. This is how Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg framed it at the time. Even in independent review of terrorist legislation at the time, his report was called A Question of Trust. So trust was really this sort of currency. And what does that enable? As well as other sort of nice buzzwords like transparency or compliance. And these sort of supposed virtues we thought as policy goals, especially when it comes to oversight, have in fact obscured a lot more sort of multifaceted, sometimes conflicting dynamics at play in controlling state surveillance. And they run the risk of promoting not only quite simplistic, but also maybe counterproductive proposals for remedying human rights implications of some of this kind of surveillance, especially around the bulk powers. And so I can talk about that a little bit in the next section, but especially but you mentioned, I liked, Arnaud, at the beginning, you talked about grave human rights abuses. So this language that we just don't really hear anymore, this framing in terms of abuse, how that's been eclipsed by a lot more procedural frames, trust, transparency, compliance, scalability. What exactly does that do? And why we should kind of be conscious about what is being enabled and foreclosed when talking in these terms. So I can go into more detail about that, but that is what we were doing with the UK.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Emma. And I think it's all in the terminology that you choose, right? And I think you explore that also in your chapter, that how can a government or someone that is ridden by a scandal regain that trust and using the right language. And so I would love to sort of further explore that. But we'll come full circle. We have still Damien and Cindy to introduce themselves. So since we are now in sort of the more close-up look, you've talked a bit about the stakeholders and sort of some of these interactions between the different individuals and groups here. And I know, Damien, in your work, you've really come across that heterogeneity within the field, right? And this tension between the political and then also sort of the intelligence field. So why don't you sort of give us sort of an overview of your work and what's the current state of affairs, if you will, in terms of where this is going in New Zealand, right? And that goes back also to the question, and this is nice how we speak to each other in terms of topical and thematic themes. Didier mentioned the Five Eyes and New Zealand being sort of at the periphery, right? It's not a key stakeholder, yet they're part of it. So maybe you can expand on some of that stuff as well. Floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks very much for organising this and for inviting me. And I think it's really important to include New Zealand in these sorts of discussions, because I think in terms of from a European or an American perspective, it's easy to overlook the unique features of what's going on in New Zealand. So I was really happy to contribute to the book and to the discussions around that. I think New Zealand's a really interesting case study when you compare it to the likes of France, the UK, the United States, because the intelligence community here doesn't really rest in the constitutional matters. It's a byproduct of New Zealand's international relations. So the intelligence services and the intelligence professions in New Zealand are rooted in its colonial legacies. And this is also for the violence workers that work on behalf of the state. So that's a curious place to start when you're looking at oversight mechanisms. And so in terms of those oversight mechanisms in New Zealand that have developed in the second half and the later years of the 20th century, there are three important ones. One is the Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee. Another one is the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security. And the third one is a periodic review of the legislation. And perhaps I'll talk about the third one a little bit later on when we talk about reform, because there's been some interesting work going on there. The Inspector General of Intelligence and Security is important because it looks at the activities of the intelligence agencies, but it only does so within a national frame. And as academics, we are quite comfortable and familiar with the term of methodological nationalism. And that's very much the approach or the perspective that our intelligence oversight agencies take. And so Didier mentioned, the third party rule being something that creates a black box within a black box. You might have secrecy provisions at a national security level, and then when you dive into those, there's exceptionally compartmentalized information, and there's another black box. And this is the material that the agencies cannot provide to oversight agencies because they're on an obligation not to disclose that. And this is interesting. You're asking about what was happening in New Zealand at the moment. A few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, the Inspector General released a report on a collection system that the GCSB had been operating in the past, of which it had no daily operational control. So another partner agency, which was never named, had control. They had build this capability, deliver this capability to GCSB, which was then collecting information. So this should be of concern to most New Zealanders. It was picked up by the Inspector General's written report. It's getting a little bit of media coverage, but probably not the extent that it deserves. And this is, it's building again on what Didier was saying before about oversight between intelligence and the overseers being something of a negotiation. And the current Inspector General in New Zealand has taken this to a new degree, where some of his reports are pre-studies. They are baseline reports. And so they investigate areas that might be of future relevance, and he's trying to set lines in the sand about what would be not only lawful, but propriety as well, what New Zealanders would expect would be okay. So this is really interesting. So within the law, he's setting tolerances and drawing lines for the agencies to play within. So I think that's a really good example of that mutual negotiation over the space. New Zealand's also a really interesting example. I tried to pick on this in the chapter, and this is around the invention of a national security strategy. A national security system that sits over the intelligence agencies. It links it with the law enforcement. It links it with the armed forces that operate abroad, but it cuts out any mention or most mention of the transnational dimensions of New Zealand's intelligence work. And the recent New Zealand National Security Strategy, our first, pretty much erases all of those transnational connections and describes it in terms of international partnerships, and that these international partnerships are means to a New Zealand national security ends. But if you take the view of transnational fields and transnational fields of insecurity, you start to see the invention of national security system and the strategy that goes with it as a laundering mechanism in a sense, or a device to shield the large parts of what the agencies do. Yeah, so sorry, rambling all over the place here. So this is interesting because New Zealand is a weak agent on that transnational field. It's not France, it's not the UK, it's not the US. It doesn't have a veto in the Security Council. So this shapes the way that actors play on the national field of power. And if you're a diplomat in New Zealand, it's almost an article of faith that you want to pursue closer defence relationships with the United States. And Emma, you mentioned before about the UK trying to set itself up as a model. We certainly see a lot of that in New Zealand with our key officials traveling to the UK to understand how they do things over there. Not so much to build the relationships with the United Kingdom, but to see how the United Kingdom interacts, I think, with the United States and the NSA and the agencies there. So that's quite interesting. So the last bit that I'll say, because I know that in the interest of time, I'll move quickly, is where to? Where should we be driving, or we should be looking as academics to see where the phenomenon of national security and transnational fields is taking us in New Zealand? And I'm quite taken by this notion of democratic security and increased participation of public in the lawmaking and the running of government and the executive government, and the different kind of pathways that might be forged. New Zealand is, again, a unique country because we have a public advisory committee on disarmament and arms control that was set up in the aftermath of the Rainbow Warrior event, where they have a public advisory committee that provides advice to the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And this is a public body that has, I think, about 8 members from civil society, academia, NGOs, and the like. And so it is an independent view from foreign affairs and from the defence establishment directly through to the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister. And I think this is one mechanism that deserves to be explored a bit further. So I'll leave it at that, and happy to answer any questions or pull on any threads a little later on in our session.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Damien, for that overview. And you've teased out also some of the issues already that we are confronting, and that I will certainly get back to in the next round of questions when we think about well, is civil society the right route? Is it through legislation, right? Is it through a body within, and which we've seen a lot, and I think DD and others have also criticized because of the lack of independence here, right? But we do have yet another esteemed panelist, Cindy. It's really a pleasure, even though you have not contributed to the volume. You've been sort of one of the long-lasting followers, and you follow U.S. questions in this matter, and so I'd love to hear your thoughts, either more specifically on the current oversight crisis, or sort of the FISA debate, and or any sort of thoughts you may contribute in terms of the U.S. case in view of what's been said here by the panel. So floor's all yours.
Well, Arnaud, thank you for inviting me. You were very kind to include me. I hope you guys can hear me. Again, I'm having bandwidth issues, so I apologize. You can still hear me. Oh, awesome. Yep. Okay, well, let me know if you can't, and I'll stop. Okay, so my research is old, but my research went back to looking at the differences in the United States between executive oversight, sort of an internal oversight, and a congressional oversight. And it feels almost quaint now, right, to go back to the 1970s and the first chapter that Felix wrote about what was going on in the United States and how that kind of started us on this road, right? It feels quaint because we're not talking about this huge vacuuming of lots of data like Emma is talking about in GCHQ and the accusations, of Edward Snowden, and we're talking about huge amounts of data. And so the 1970s era scandals seem, like I said, almost quaint, in comparison, right? Because we're talking about they seem like smaller problems, although there's certainly problems. So my point in my research originally was all about how the executive branch of the United States in this case, and we have parallels in all the other governments that we're talking about, there's an advantage to doing our intelligence well so that none of these things happen, right? Like, as soon as the intelligence gets on the front page, that's a bad thing. So it's in the advantage of the executive branch not to overstep its bounds. And so, as Damien pointed out, if you were to create a whole new system of national security and kind of impose it over top of all the stuff we're already doing, you would probably create something amazingly perfect. But we can't do that, right? We're making this up as we go along. And so that executive branch wants that, doesn't want to overstep any of those bounds. And as Didier pointed out, even the people who work within the intelligence community, we don't want to overstep our bounds either. As you may remember from last time, I'm an old hand at this. I was an old knuckle dragger, human intelligence collector. And, if you were called up before Congress, that was bad. You didn't want that. So having rules and having those norms is so much better than not having them. So I would put that as a perspective. And it's just important to me to emphasize that the internal oversight, as Arnaud, you emphasize we're going to talk about in a minute, whether or not you want that civil society oversight, that congressional legislative oversight, or that internal oversight. And I think that they all have to work together. And I think we're all probably going to agree on that. But the internal oversight may have the potential to have the most impact. As we all know, congressmen and legislative elected representatives in a democracy, they're going to go for the easiest thing to pass, right? What is the easiest thing to do? And so that's why we end up with what everyone's talking about, that some of what is supposed to be oversight ends up legitimizing the intelligence collection in whatever capacity it's going to be. And that's exactly the opposite of what we've all talked about. And as Elspeth pointed out, this is a historical, there's a evolution here that we are potentially looking now at collection that was not possible before. And whatever solutions we had before probably don't work with the new AI challenges that we get now. So to pass those is going to be difficult. And as we all know, the best way to pass something that's difficult is an ad hoc way. And that might not be what we want, but I suspect that's what will be possible. So those are my 2 cents out there with a few of the little pieces of research that I've done aside from this book that I think is excellent. And I think you bring up great ideas. So those are my
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cindy, for sharing this. And I think it brings sort of the historical component back in. And even when you go before church, the Church Commission in the 70s, right? I think if I'm not mistaken, the New York Times was the first to report on sort of the mischievings or the operations the Central Intelligence Agency was doing in the post World War II era. And interestingly, there's some research being done currently with public archives accessible in New York City of the Times that really shows the conversations the investigative reporters did have with sort of the agency and with sort of also a former director in terms of like, yes, you can publish this, but maybe we should proofread it, right? So I mean, tongue in cheek, I'm like what you mentioned, Cindy, this idea of, well, oversight, but then is it censorship, question mark, right? So I think that brings in a whole array of questions. I want to sort of throw this out and open up. I know in the interest of time, we'll probably try to do a twofer, right? We'll try to think about some of the oversight challenges, but then to sort of not be the Debbie Downer, but the eternal optimist. Maybe you can then also pitch this in terms of what pathways forward do you see in terms of reform, right? And I think Cindy mentioned nicely how it has to be sort of a holistic effort. The book wouldn't be called or make reference to sort of this transversal field, right? This idea that it has to be transnational, but that it is really cutting through when we think of a geometric perspective, right? it really pierces through these different layers, through the different stakeholders, and everyone has a different objective. And I think Cindy mentioned sort of stakeholders with upcoming elections here, right? When can you pass a bill? It usually passes when you have the lowest a common denominator. Is that really what you'd like to from sort of a normative or legal perspective? Likely not, because it's oftentimes very ineffective. So I want to come full circle, and maybe everyone has a few minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, to sort of reflect on some of the oversight challenges specifically for a case that you choose, and or then some remedies that you see could potentially be a way forward, either for your specific case, or as Didier pointed out earlier, since the book was really an effort to come into conversation in terms of these different entities on the ground, right? Whether they are at the national level or whether they're at the Five Eye level, where it's transnationally speaking, and having these difficulties from internal oversight in particular. So I would love to hear some of your thoughts here. So Didier, if you want to kick it off here, round 2 and 3 combined due to time limitations, which is a good sign, I guess.
Yes. Well, I want to come back to this idea, the problem of oversight, and to have a form of democratic control will work only when at the international level, it's accepted that you have a general problem of legitimacy of all the global northern states with their practice of secret services. It's not sufficient to say we are doing less bad than the other one. You have now a structural element in which the population have a very bad attitude vis-a-vis the intelligence services. They don't believe them, and they put them as factor of war and not factors of peace, to say that very bluntly. They are now engaged in multiple activities where they say it's defensive when it's offensive. And they are engaged more and more with arms sales, which was not so much the case if we compare many years ago. Of course, they were connecting with, but they were not acting into. Now, you have more and more previous people who were in charge of intelligence services who have been sent to private companies to develop technologies which are sold to other countries and without even a national security strategy. The idea of a national security strategy is exploding. And that's where is the problem of legitimacy. The national is not sufficiently coherent to give a sense of centralization of capacity. I will not speak about Israel and what we have seen, but it's one of the cases where we have seen the division between the different intelligence services, the intelligence services speaking instead of the diplomats, or even instead of the military. And that's also what happened, and we have seen that in Ukraine. And of course, I don't speak about Russia. It's even worse, or another world where you don't have the minimum level of autonomy. But we have seen also this kind of partition. So where we need the recognition at the highest international level that no one, even the US Congress, has no capacity to regulate the problem if they don't agree that the intelligence services practice need to be strongly reformed by a series of bodies which will have the capacity to have an independent or outside look connected with the people who work at the lowest level, and to have full information after a while. So I will not enter into the detail, but I think it's really this problem of legitimacy. And for the moment, it's recognized by the small countries. It's absolutely refused by the countries which are at the top level of the external activities and engage into different form of conflict over the world. And I think that without that, we will not have a serious chance. And that's why I think the solution cannot come from the intelligence oversight themselves, but by legislation on privacy, as Elspeth has explained. If we enhance the level of international privacy to the level of the Convention of Torture, or if we create a capacity that all the rapporteur and the UN can have a kind, of course, of check when you have crises and big crises, which can follow what's going on minimally, and who can maybe set up also some standards. Belgium seems to be quite active in terms of setting some idea of standards and of what is naturally expected as limits in a democracy. So to take back not of what is forbidden, but what is expected, that would be rules that anyone who transgresses this rule know that he is not anymore on a national security, he is doing a form of violence which is illegitimate. So I stop there.
Thank you so much, Didier. And I think that's a great example that we can sort of pass on the baton to Elspeth, because the idea that you brought up is sort of in the national or domestic context of sort of a model, Belgium being sort of a model, and one could question sort of like, can they, and this is probably for further debate, right? Can there, or is it possible for the Belgian government to do that because of their limited international influence? And we had long discussions also during our workshops, right? Or is it also possible that more important international stakeholders could serve as a role model, right? And so Didier, you mentioned the tension or the issues that come up because of the interdependence between national lawmakers and the international context, and so Elspeth is the comparative law expert here, and so in terms of like, it worked for torture to a certain extent, right? And would it work for privacy? But the floor is all yours in terms of like reflecting on some of these issues in terms of what are the key challenges and how can we get out of there?
Thank you so much, Arno, and to all of the other speakers. This is a wonderful debate. I think my contribution is to insist on the role of civil society. That if we depend exclusively on people within the services, even on our lawmakers, without a civil society movement saying, wait a minute, what are you doing with my data? What are the limitations? The chances of having a successful conclusion or a successful outcome is much more limited. In our chapter in the book, we look at the way in which international civil society began an extraordinarily successful campaign to abolish and to prohibit the use of torture, to define it and prohibit it. This is not to say that torture no longer exists. It's just that as soon as a claim that somebody is carrying out torture is made, there is almost universal recoil from that. So how did we move from torture being a normal part of criminal justice and warfare to one where torture is completely unacceptable? And we follow how this happened at the international level, particularly following the 1980s and the transformation, of course, of the South American states from dictatorships notorious for torture to democracies, and how this created a civil society movement which pushed at the international level and at the national level for new limitations, new prohibitions. And we suggest in the book that this game plan for civil society, which was used in respect of torture, is what we need now in respect of the right to privacy.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And that's certainly when we think about some of the things, how grave human rights violations, you mentioned the 70s and 80s, right, with torture, disappearance in Latin America, right, what the role of civil society was there, but then in conjunction, what then the court system was able to do is sort of a nice example where law and civil society or norms go then hand in hand. Thank you so much for sharing this, Elspeth. Emma, what's sort of your take on some of the challenges? You teased out some of them already earlier. If you want to sort of dig a little deeper with particular in view of what that means for oversight, right? Because you mentioned that the UK was a model, and so, but you said also like, yeah, they were a model in sort of whitewashing this in a way. And so, if you want to expand a little on that and show us a roadmap maybe into the future.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, I'm not sure if I have a roadmap, but I think, yeah, very interesting about privacy, because in the interviews we did see a lot of the civil society space sort of converge around, you know, privacy as the main stake in this battle, this main kind of mode of critique. So even the sort of freedom of expression, people moving towards privacy and stuff. So an aside that, yeah, so that's very interesting. So what do I think the main challenges? And just to speak again to what Elspeth was saying about civil society's role, and not so much the legal sphere, but more in the sort of vernacular or this discursive space. And what we did in our chapter is really to compare, you know, some of the language that was circulating around intelligence practices in the 80s when it came to, you know, surveillance of certain political actors, compared to the Snowden revelations. And we compared, you know, what work is abuse doing, or this language of abuse. And you've mentioned several times, Arno, like human rights abuse, grave human rights abuse. What's happened to this language of abuse? Because it's been eclipsed by these much more, you know, less provocative language of trust and compliance and transparency and stuff. So we argued that, you know, what abuse was doing, and abuse of power, is that it exposes surveillance and other intelligence practices to these dynamics of critique and justification, right? So abuse does something that all of this languages of trust and stuff doesn't. Not only that, but it also, you know, when you talk about abuse, you're also making the targets of this surveillance into subjects who can demand redress, right? They can make rights claims. They've been subject to abuse, you know, so they're invisibilized, they're obfuscated when it comes to trust. When we talk about we need to rebuild trust, what does that mean, right? It really does create this sort of obscuring. So with trust, we kind of mapped what was that doing, and what a challenge it is to even frame it in this way. It just kind of forecloses the debate, structures, you know, who's allowed even into this field of surveillance oversight. As I mentioned, it displaces a lot of this contestation, a lot of this hierarchy. And what it does, unlike abuse, is that it imagines, you know, public that are just this trusting public, you know, so it just presents this idea that, oh, there's, you know, trust has been lost, but the public want to trust us again, and we have to rebuild. We just have to rebuild it, and they want us to keep them safe. So this is the kind of frame. I think another interesting thing that it does is that it renders a lot of the actions and these practices of intelligence agencies in the register of error, right, instead of abuse. So at best, you have, there's something terrible that happens, and any inquiry then into an abusive practice becomes unthinkable at best. It's just a catalogue of errors, and we see that in the UK with the IPCO, the oversight body. They have few pages at the end that catalogue serious errors, and if you read this, it can be quite horrifying, some of these so-called errors, right? So I think, what can we do? I don't know, going forward, I think it is really interesting. And I just to look, at some of the, to try to sort of reclaim some of these frames that have really been closed down, and just some of these democratic practices that have been unthinkable, that have been rendered unthinkable. How can we kind of circulate them again? How can they recirculate in the discursive space? And I think a lot of them, like this language of abuse that we see so much in the legal sphere, what does it mean if it can circulate more in discursive space in civil society? And also to kind of reformulate the language so that it does focus more on the people that are really affected by these practices and that suffer because of these practices. And I think what we did in the chapter, we looked at a lot of the work around police abuse, which we see the language of abuse used when we talk about a lot of police practices. So this could be one idea, something to anchor a discussion in, to think more about these sort of bulk powers and surveillance, and go into AI. So kind of, I know it's very difficult, especially for civil society, to even push this frames out a little bit, and even when they talk about transparency, it's such a impoverished placeholder for democracy, and they talk about this as being a last resort. But really to expand and to think about oversight practice in these different modes of democratic practice, when we think of oversight in these ways, which could come from the legal sphere, especially anchored around privacy as this collective right, and thinking in terms of abuse and making rights claims based on that abuse could be one idea. But I have no idea. I spoke to these civil society people who are sort of banging their head against the wall. So that is my contribution.
Thank you so much. It's certainly a Sisyphean task, but still worthwhile. And I agree with you in terms of sort of how can you create a more acute awareness again if the language becomes so euphemistic and it is not shocking, and or if there's this dullness also in civil society, if it doesn't concern them directly. But I think the storytelling, what you mentioned, like exposing and highlighting some of these stories and bringing that to the front lines, and then might be a good strategy in terms of mobilizing. And I'm saying this on a different matter, since the Library of Congress is right next to the Supreme Court here, and you can imagine there were quite a few things this spring that came up, and the capacity of both sides, right, the pro and con sides, trying to mobilize their constituencies was quite interesting to see from a social movement theory perspective, right? And then how that reverberates in terms of then the media presence and then it going viral. And so, but I wanna continue on that route with you, Damien, and you mentioned that in the government there was sort of like a reform process with the periodic review, right? And so maybe you can also link that in terms of the micro and the macro, right? The national level and or in terms of Five Eyes, right? Since we're thinking about transnational oversight, and I got really frustrated when I tried to sort of get access to sort of the oversight board at Five Eyes. basis. It's this the regular phrase when I try to do interviews here, on a need to know basis. And so yeah, and so on the website they're trying to create some transparency, but then behind closed doors that is a different story, right? And so maybe you can tell us a bit about the New Zealand case, if you have some insights, since you do work on Five Eyes stuff. Great. If not, I think the micro national level is plenty of us to chew on. So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm really enjoying the other points made by the panelists. So thank you to them. I want to start by, I've got 4 points to make in relation to what you've just asked, Arnold. But the first one is about the national security strategy that Didier was mentioning before, and the importance of that around shaping activities of those agencies. And I think it's really important to perhaps rethink what we understand the purpose of national security strategies to be. So if conventionalist thinking, institutional thinking, will think about the better coordination of resources among different parts of a security apparatus to be more effective and more efficient in the delivery of security services. That's not how I see the New Zealand National Security Strategy. I see that more as a governance document which secures the position of some security professionals in a hierarchy above others, and in particular security bureaucrats who are not involved in the collection of intelligence or the use of force. And I think this isn't just a situation where security bureaucrats get to speak on behalf of those intelligence professionals or violence workers, but they don't speak on behalf, but they render it possible for the intelligence agencies not to speak in public. Right, so they push away the expectation. And I think the national security strategies perform a particularly important function here, particularly around transparency, and this idea of releasing information in a controlled way is not necessarily to improve the public's understanding of what's going on. So in terms of solutions, I mean, one possible one that I would love to see, or would like to see a public debate take place around in New Zealand, is to maybe shift or enlarge the mandates of the intelligence agencies themselves, and perhaps even start thinking about having the protection of human rights at the forefront or among the various functions of these agencies, and also to make them accountable for fostering an informed citizenry. Now, in New Zealand, the civil society is fragmented. It's small. New Zealand's small, and the civil society is even smaller. And so I kind of think in terms of that public social contract between the provision of secrecy and the building of an informed public, I think goes hand in hand in the same agency. But I'm pretty pessimistic about that being actually resolvable. And one of the reasons for that is because we're going through a period of reform here in New Zealand, and those one of the reforms that two kind of trajectories of reform. One was the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the terrorist attack in Christchurch on the 15th of March 2019, and there was a whole list of recommendations that the government accepted from the Royal Commissioners, and they included basically reforming and reconfiguring the intelligence agencies to build a new intelligence agency that would sit above the other agencies, to build foster a network of independent academics working on terrorism studies. But each of these recommendations, and there was something like 50 of them or 40 something, are either being rolled back at the moment, or they were subverted in some way, so that the agency that was in charge of administering and implementing these recommendations was actually at the heart of the criticisms of the Royal Commission itself. And so there's this really kind of vested interest that was going to never allow for reforms to take place. For example, the minister in charge of the reforms was also the minister in charge of the intelligence agencies. All right, so the oversight body in New Zealand, the Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee, is chaired by the Prime Minister, who's the Prime Minister of National Security and Intelligence. On that committee is the minister in charge of the intelligence agencies. This is supposed to be the body that holds those agencies to account. So one of the periodic reviews of the intelligence legislation suggested that this was a conflict of interest, and that they've proposed a recommendation that a new committee be set up, and it contained no members of the that are in charge of the executive in these areas. But we have a new government in New Zealand about 6 months ago, and they were repealing more legislation than anything that they're implementing. So I don't think the chances of that very good recommendation by Sir Terence Arnold and Matanuku Makuika, the reviewers, will ever see the light of day. I see that being kicked for touch in the long tall grass. But more positively, I see a solution along the same lines as what Elspeth was talking about in terms of privacy law and the international law elements. But I wonder whether there's scope here where you've looked at privacy law and its ability to cast light on or protect against surveillance of foreigners and also national citizens. And I wonder if we build on Didier's connection between intelligence work and violence work, which I think is largely underexplored in critical intelligence studies in particular. If we look at that, then the body of rules that might be applicable here is international criminal law, the most serious of international crimes based around political violence, often state violence, but not always. And I wonder whether or not like the civil society might have a role in reshaping or reforming or amending the Rome Statute to give greater focus on the complicity of intelligence agencies to state leaders when they commit these atrocities. So they're the 4 points that I'd like to make. So thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Damien. And so we'll come full circle with some propositions that are certainly driven by civil society and looking at some of the institutional changes, but then circling back to some legal sort of frameworks that could help in terms of alleviating some of these issues. Before I hand it over to Cindy to say also a few words, I do see we had a couple of questions in the audience, so maybe we can tie those in. One of them was sort of like this idea of or the concept that we brought up here of political hesitancy, sort of the willingness is not there, and so. What's there? How can that political willingness be much more acute or there? And I think Cindy, you touched on this right when we talked about the elections and the common denominator is relatively low. And then a second question, and we'll basically be closing the session after Cindy has a few moments to also express her thoughts, but I'll give you guys certainly some 30 seconds takeaway for everyone, so you get another chance to finalize your thoughts here. But the second question here that we have from the audience, and we certainly brought this up in our research, but it's about these information power brokers, right? The ones that sell the data, and so the commodification in all of that, right? So the bucket stops here, right? Or the buck stops here, and so you, Cindy, you don't have to answer all these questions, but I want to give you also a chance to sort of reflect on some of these challenges in terms of oversight and where you see the road forward. You said like there needs to be an amalgam of like multiple forces and stakeholders, but anything that you wanted to add here, floor is all yours.
Yeah. Well, Arnaud, you told me I wouldn't have to prepare anything. So I have like 1,000 notes here based on all the stuff that everybody has said, and I'm going to forget all of it. So at any rate, a few things that came forward to me as we were talking is that overseers, they don't know what they don't know. You know, as someone who's been in the Intel community, they don't know what we're doing, because you set out intelligence collection on a path, and if you don't simultaneously produce a way to oversee that, it's like adding barnacles to the boat. You're not really changing the boat. You're just adding stuff onto the sides. Okay, you're not really changing what you've done, because you've set aside the intelligence collection to just keep on going without anyone looking at it. And when that happens, the legislators have to come in and require reporting, right? That's what they do. They say, okay, every 6 months you have to tell me what happened in terms of human rights abuses in blah, blah, blah. And that's supposed to keep, human intelligence collection from going off the rails. The only way that works is it's very context specific, and you set that context up and those specifics ahead of time. But again, you don't know what you don't know. And when we're talking about such a huge issue as privacy, I feel like we're tilting at windmills unless we pick some very, very specific contexts to talk about how to oversee that. And as Elspeth would say, I'm sure, this is going to all be in court cases. This is going to all be in very specific events, right? But we don't know what those events are going to be yet. So I would say that you have to create that capacity to oversee it later, but you have to create that capacity now. And it is going to have to be in a wide variety of, like we said, stakeholders. It's going to have to be in the legal realm. It's going to have to be in the civil society realm. But I feel like SIGINT, in this question of intelligence collection in terms of privacy and just collecting data, is probably the hardest case we can make this in. There are probably much smaller, much easier cases to go forward with. This is probably the hardest one. So I would suggest we potentially find something a little bit easier to work with to start, but that's one.
Thank you so much, Cindy. This is certainly, we got to start somewhere. And I think the idea that you mentioned here, and when we specifically talk about the legal realm and lawmakers, it becomes then very, very specific. And I think I wanted to circle back to sort of the FISA court issues and the renewal of the act, where policymakers, because of data centers that were apart from these big tech giants, right, third-party data centers, as I mentioned at the very beginning, became then certainly a clause in the new law, any other service provider. And as I mentioned initially, while they took out restaurants or other gathering places because they didn't want citizens to be surveilled on in these more social settings, some reporting certainly said but anyone that has a server, whether that is a co-op building, whether that is a laundromat, right, might very well fall under some of these stipulations, right? And so I think that is certainly a legal battle, and the implications we'll see in the months and years. I mean, it's a 2-year act, and then it needs to be renewed, but within the next 6 to 8 months, it'll be certainly interesting to follow that issue. But as promised, I want to go around the room, sort of some of the takeaways that you would like to share with our audience and participants for the future. What are some last thoughts? 30 seconds. Didier, shall we start with you, and then we'll make our way around the table again?
Yes, maybe one element which come, and that's the work of Thorsten Wetzling, which is not with us, is to think about, put on the agenda the theft of data by other countries or foreign companies into the mandate. And then to insist that a risk of complicity of the service exists if they facilitate the theft of data or the exchange of data and complicity. So if they have that in their own realm, we can verify if they have done it or not. One example would be, for example, Europol. Is Europol controlling or not really what the other intelligence services of third-party countries in Europe are doing? In theory, they need, but in practice. So to go that way, and that's also what has been done a little bit if we want to involve civil society, if you think about anti-corruption and against corruption of elites. You have some international body who have, especially with Obama, who have tried to help these civil society bodies to be in a record and analysis of what the government were doing themselves. So that's in 30 seconds, it was the max.
No, that is terrific. And I like how you sort of bridge the gap with Cindy ended. We need to work on something specific. And Torsten Wetzling's proposal here is certainly a great great segue into that. Elspeth, your turn.
I would just say, remember to support civil society and never underestimate the possibility of civil society to bring about change.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Emma.
Yes, yeah, very quickly. Yeah, so I think that what is possible or what is interesting is, like, just as we've spoken about, organizing this narrative in a way that really does enable a more profound mode of challenge of these human rights violations, because as Cindy said, it's very difficult with SIGINT because it's so intangible. So precisely making this tangible, and what the ways that we found that we've discussed about here, I mean, the link to violence is one way, abuse is another way. Yeah, so it really is, yeah, trying to shift the space to talk about, creating subjectivities through which these rights claims can be anchored, instead of sort of all this obfuscation.
Excellent. Thank you. That is also a laudable goal to achieve in terms of like lawmakers, civil societies, but also within the services, right? We're demonizing all service members, but we've also had some service members that worked with us on the project, right? So that also needs to be put forward, right? That from within, that change can also come from within, right? So great, Emma. Thank you so much. Damien.
Thanks. So maybe 3 takeaways or 3 questions. One is around data broking, and that was from a question from the floor. For me, the concern here is around state use of the data. And Elspeth said earlier in an opening statement around data given to officials with the purpose in mind, and then that information has to be, that private information has to be used only for those purposes. In New Zealand, you've got bulk data agreements where intelligence agencies can go to any other government agency and get the data from there. So I think that there's some questions around the legitimacy and that trade-off between privacy and security there. Secondly, just building on that discussion around SIGINT and the complexity of SIGINT, and I think it gets even more complex when you look at the interplay between SIGINT and cybersecurity, and then you've got AI involved in those targeting processes or whatever, how you would describe them, and then how do you attribute responsibility when AI is crunching the numbers, or AI is used in the targeting, or AI is used in the collection? I think that's an important consideration. And finally, the third kind of question is, what is the role for us as academics in all of this going forward? I mean, yes, we can support civil society, and I think we should do, but in terms of our roles as academics, what's the scope of the contribution we can make? And I think when I read this book, the second time I read through, Francois' interview with Didier, I thought was one of the real gems of this. And, I make my students in my postgraduate terrorism course read that interview because it talks about not academics being subject to the game of security, but that actually academics have a role in playing its own game of academia, but of which security professionals can be enlisted and enrolled in, and then they can go back to their security professions with new skills of strategy and new cognitive abilities and those sorts of things, and do their jobs better. So yeah, those are the 3 points that I'd like to end on.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Damien. And I did share in the chat the book is available in open access, right? So you have the link there. It's certainly a read for any good citizen. You don't have to be sort of a geek that is only into security studies and intelligence studies and oversight studies, right? So last but not least, Cindy, a few words before we all part.
I wanted to go back to your question about FISA and point out that I think one avenue would be to create a new FISA. It was not created to address this big question of SIGINT. It was created to do something much smaller. So maybe changing that would be one thing, but that's a very small point. I also wanted to echo what Damien said and pat everybody on the back, because the way through is going to be really interesting, fun case studies that illustrate the points that we're trying to make. And that's going to be in academia. That's where that's going to come from. So I'd like to pat everybody on the back and say that's where all the information that we create is going to come from. And I would echo what Didier said, because he comes up with these creative things that I never thought of. And that's what intelligence, both oversight and intelligence itself, needs. We need these creative thoughts. Didn't we say that was why 9/11, one of the reasons about 9/11, we didn't have the creativity to think like the terrorists, right? So we need to think like we need to red team this, yeah, to borrow a phrase. So so again, pat everybody on the back, because I think the more we collect examples, the better off we are.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cindy. Yeah, Didier?
A final element, it's about the Guardant website. The Guardant website may be in danger because it come to a close, and if we don't find money somewhere to pay the provider who is maintaining the website, they may close. And the series has just accepted, but as an archive and not to keep it live. And I think that if we can keep it live, it will help also, because everything we have done has been used by other researchers who have used, and some of them have even proposed to participate. But here I'm emeritus, so it's the generation which is active who have to seek, and any idea immediately would be important, because that's really the closing date is by the end of the month. So and it's not. I stop there. But
yeah, no, thank you.
Thank about collective work. That's also one of the problems of academia, because the finding when they are closed, the funding when they are closed, they close and they don't even think. It's a very small amount of money, but it's not there.
Yeah, that is a good final remark, and so that is certainly a shout out to anyone out there, and I will also pass that along and reach out to you, because it is certainly by maintaining and continue that type of work that change is possible, right? And so I really greatly appreciated you being here at all wee hours of the night or day. And it was such a lovely panel, so enriching. And this recording will certainly live on and hopefully inspire many, whether that is students, scholars, practitioners, folks from the field, right, from the services. And I wish you all well, and thank you again for participating. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care.